Brad Mercer thought humiliating the quiet woman at Lane 7 would earn him another round of laughs from his regular customers. But he had no idea he was standing at the edge of the most embarrassing moment of his career. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe people should be judged by skill instead of appearance, stay with this story because what happened inside that shooting range left an entire room speechless. The Saturday crowd at Iron Ridge Tactical Range was exactly what Brad liked. Loud men in baseball caps, expensive gear cases, polished boots, and enough swagger to fill the concrete lanes with ego before a single target moved. The sharp scent of gun oil floated through the air, mixing with burnt powder and stale coffee from the front counter. Electronic scoreboards blinked overhead, while brass casings rolled across the rubber floor like tiny golden marbles. Brad stood behind the check-in desk in his black instructor polo, arms folded across his broad chest, soaking in the attention of three regular shooters who treated every weekend like their personal competition show. He had spent 12 years building a reputation as the loudest voice in the building, the kind of man who believed confidence and competence were the same thing. So when the front door opened and a woman in a faded gray sweater stepped inside, carrying an old canvas rifle bag, Brad's lips curled before she even reached the counter. Claire Donovan moved quietly, almost too quietly for the noisy room. Her jeans were plain, her boots worn, her blonde hair tied low at the nape of her neck. There was nothing flashy about her, nothing that matched the $1,000 optics and customized rifles displayed around her. She looked like someone who had stopped by the wrong place on her way to buy groceries. A few heads turned. One man smirked. Another elbowed his friend. Brad caught it all and immediately sensed opportunity. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, dragging out the last word with a syrupy politeness that felt more like an insult than courtesy. Claire set the old rifle bag gently on the counter. "I'd like to rent a lane for an hour," she said. Her voice was calm, almost soft enough to disappear beneath the hum of ventilation fans. Brad leaned back and gave her a long look from head to toe. "You sure?" he asked loudly enough for the nearby men to hear. "Most first-timers start with the gift shop. We sell cute little souvenir earmuffs." A burst of laughter cracked through the lobby. Claire's expression did not move. She simply slid her driver's license across the counter and repeated, "One lane, please." That only made Brad want the spotlight more. People like him were uncomfortable around silence because silence gave them nothing to control. He tapped the license against the desk, pretending to inspect it while his regulars drifted closer, sensing entertainment. "Lane rentals aren't cheap," he said, "and our long-distance section isn't for casual visitors taking selfies." More chuckles. Someone muttered, "She probably saw this on YouTube." Brad grinned. Claire looked past him through the glass partition at the firing lanes stretching 100 yards into fluorescent light and gray concrete. Rows of suspended paper targets moved back and forth on metal tracks. The atmosphere felt cold, industrial, designed for precision rather than comfort. Her eyes settled there for a second too long, and something unreadable flickered behind them, but Brad missed it completely. He was too busy enjoying his audience. "Tell you what," he said, sliding the lane form toward her with exaggerated generosity. "Lane 7 just opened. Let's see what you've got." The men around him smirked wider. Brad thought he was assigning a joke. He did not yet realize he had just chosen the exact place where his arrogance would begin to collapse. Claire picked up the clipboard, signed the waiver without hesitation, and followed the narrow hallway toward Lane 7 while the sound of muffled target buzzers echoed from deeper inside the building. Behind her, Brad Mercer exchanged amused glances with his regular shooters, three middle-aged men who spent every Saturday bragging about split times, trigger upgrades, and competition scores as if they were discussing military strategy. One of them, a red-faced contractor named Vince Holloway, leaned against the counter and chuckled. $10 says she asks which end the bullet comes out of. The others laughed hard enough that even the cashier at the coffee station looked over. Brad smirked and slipped a set of ear protection around his neck. He was not about to let this little sideshow happen without front-row seating. By the time Claire stepped through the heavy soundproof door into the long-distance firing section, Brad and his group were already trailing behind her like boys headed toward a carnival game. Lane 7 sat near the far wall, bordered by gray dividers scarred with years of powder residue and tiny impact marks. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale industrial glow over the rubber flooring. The air was cooler here, and every metallic click seemed sharper, cleaner, almost surgical. Claire set her worn canvas bag on the waist-high bench and unzipped it with slow, deliberate hands. Brad noticed immediately that the bag was old military issue, faded at the seams, but he dismissed it. Plenty of people bought surplus gear online because it looked rugged. Need help figuring that out? He asked, loud enough for the neighboring lanes to hear. Two younger shooters paused mid-conversation and turned their heads. Vince folded his arms. Maybe we should start her at 10 yards, he joked. With a paper plate. More snickering bounced off the concrete walls. Claire ignored every word. She removed a simple pair of shooting glasses from the front pocket of her bag, wiped them once on the edge of her sweater, and put them on. Then she lifted out a rifle wrapped in a plain cloth sleeve. It was not flashy. No polished custom stock. No oversized scope painted in expensive matte colors. Just a clean, understated precision rifle with the kind of restrained efficiency that looked almost boring to anyone who did not know what they were seeing. Brad raised an eyebrow. Well, I will give you this, he said. At least you brought something that resembles the real thing. Claire laid the rifle on the bench and checked the chamber with one smooth motion. Vince's grin faded for half a second. There was something too practiced in that movement. Too automatic. But Brad kept going. Men like him never noticed warning signs once they committed to performing confidence. Let us make this interesting, he announced, walking to the lane control panel. With a few taps, he sent a fresh target gliding all the way down the track until it locked at the 100-yard mark. The paper looked tiny under the fluorescent lights, just a distant circle suspended in gray emptiness. Brad turned dramatically. There you go. Full distance. Let us see if YouTube taught you anything useful. A few nearby shooters laughed and stepped aside to watch. The mood shifted from routine practice to public spectacle. Even people who had not heard the earlier jokes sensed that something humiliating was being arranged. Claire slipped on her hearing protection. Brad noticed she did not fumble with the straps. She did not ask where to stand. She did not look uncertain the way beginners always did when facing a target that far away. Instead, she rested one hand lightly on the rifle and stared downrange with a stillness that felt strangely disconnected from the noise around her. Brad mistook that stillness for nervousness. What is wrong? He called out. Too far. Claire finally looked at him, not angry, not embarrassed, just calm. No, she said quietly. It is fine. Those 3 words should have sounded ordinary. Instead, something in her tone made the laughter around lane 7 thin out just a little. But Brad Mercer, hungry for one more round of attention, smiled wider and pushed the humiliation even further. Brad Mercer stepped closer to the lane divider and tapped the metal frame with his knuckles like a game show host introducing a contestant. One shot, he said, grinning at the small crowd that had now formed behind the safety line. Just one. Let us see if our mystery guest can at least hit paper. Vince Holloway laughed and reached into his pocket. I have got 20 on complete, miss. Another man, wearing mirrored shooting glasses and a camouflage hat, added, I say she flinches before she even pulls the trigger. A few bills changed hands. The betting started casually, but the cruelty underneath it was unmistakable. Claire. Donovan stood at the bench as if none of it existed. She opened a slim ammunition case and selected a single round with the same measured calm someone might use choosing a pen. Brad noticed that she handled it with careful fingertips, no wasted motion, no fumbling. Still, he refused to let doubt enter. Pride has a way of blinding loud people before it humiliates them. Do you want me to explain breathing control? He asked with exaggerated patience. Or should we start with how the safety works? Laughter again, though thinner now. Claire slid the round into place and closed the bolt with a clean metallic click that echoed farther than it should have. Something about that sound turned a few heads from neighboring lanes. It was not the clumsy slam of an amateur trying to imitate confidence. It was crisp, efficient, practiced. Vince shifted his weight. She watched more than one YouTube video, he muttered, trying to keep the joke alive. Brad folded his arms. All right, sweetheart, here is the challenge. 100 yards. One shot. If you hit the target, I will refund your lane fee. He paused for effect and smirked. If you miss, maybe you stick to hobbies with less noise. A couple of men chuckled on cue. Claire rested the rifle on the bench mount, but did not shoulder it yet. Instead, she looked downrange for several quiet seconds, studying the suspended paper target swaying almost imperceptibly in the conditioned airflow. Then she glanced once toward the ventilation vent above lane 6, then toward the tiny digital weather monitor mounted near the far wall. Brad frowned. Most customers never noticed that monitor. It measured indoor drift and temperature changes for competition days. Claire said nothing, but her eyes had already taken in every variable in the room. Across the long-distance section, an older man emerged from the maintenance corridor carrying a clipboard. His name tag read Ethan Cole, owner. At 68, Ethan moved slower than he once had, but his eyes remained razor-sharp. He had been reviewing a shipment invoice when the unusual silence around lane 7 caught his attention. Shooting ranges were noisy places, but there was a distinct difference between routine noise and spectators holding their breath for someone else to fail. He looked over and saw Brad performing for his little audience. Ethan sighed. Brad had always confused instruction with humiliation. Yet before Ethan could step in, he noticed Claire. Specifically, he noticed her posture. She had not even raised the rifle, but the alignment of her shoulders, the angle of her feet, the stillness in her neck, all of it struck him with the faint discomfort of forgotten memory. Ethan stopped walking. Brad, unaware of the owner now watching, spread his hands theatrically. "Come on, ma'am. Everybody is waiting." Several people leaned in. Even the electronic target carriers from nearby lanes had gone still as shooters abandoned their own practice to witness the expected embarrassment. Claire finally lifted the rifle. Not quickly, not nervously, smoothly. The stock settled into her shoulder as though it belonged there. Her cheek lowered to the rest with almost mathematical precision. Brad's grin remained on his face, but it stiffened at the edges. Vince stopped smiling altogether. Ethan Cole narrowed his eyes. He had seen that exact economy of motion before, years ago, in places where nobody joked at the firing line. The room did not know it yet, but the mockery had just passed the point of no return. Claire Donovan did not squeeze the trigger. Not yet. She remained perfectly still behind the rifle, her right eye aligned with the scope, her breathing so controlled that even the loose strand of blonde hair near her cheek barely moved. The concrete room seemed to shrink around that silence. Brad Mercer shifted uncomfortably and forced a laugh that sounded louder than before. "Take your time," he said. "We are all enjoying the suspense." But no one laughed with him this time. Something invisible had begun to change in the atmosphere around lane 7. It was subtle, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air stops feeling ordinary. Claire adjusted the elevation dial one precise click, then another. Her gloved finger brushed the windage turret with familiarity that made Ethan Cole's stomach tighten. He took 2 slow steps closer, his clipboard lowering. To his side, he had spent 30 years around marksmen, competitors, military instructors, hobbyists, and loud amateurs with expensive toys. There was a language to handling a rifle that had nothing to do with words. Most people wrestled with equipment. Skilled people became quiet around it. Claire looked quiet in a way Ethan recognized, but could not yet place. Behind the safety line, Vince Holloway leaned toward Brad and whispered, "She is dragging this out because she is scared." Brad nodded quickly, eager to believe it. "Exactly," he said louder, trying to reclaim control of the room. Beginners freeze when they realize distance is not the same as television. But his voice no longer landed the same way. Even the men who had laughed earlier were now watching Claire instead of him. Her left hand settled under the stock with delicate firmness. Her shoulder angle lowered half an inch. She exhaled, paused, and inhaled again through her nose. Ethan noticed the cadence immediately. Controlled respiratory reset. Not common range behavior. Not casual practice. Brad noticed none of the technical details, only that his audience was slipping away from him, and arrogance always grows meaner when it feels ignored. "Maybe the rifle is too much for you," he said. "I can bring out something lighter. Pink, perhaps." A nervous chuckle came from somewhere in the back, but it died almost instantly. Claire did not react. Her eyes remained downrange. Through the scope, the black center of the target sat 100 yards away, no larger than a coin held at arm's length. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly off the metal carrier track. The ventilation current moved left to right in tiny, nearly invisible pulses. Claire watched all of it. Then she made one final micro-adjustment to the rear bag under the stock. Ethan's breath caught. He knew that movement. It was the sort of correction taught only to shooters trained to remove every unnecessary variable. This was not someone hoping to hit paper. This was someone narrowing probability into certainty. Brad opened his mouth for another joke, but Ethan raised one hand without taking his eyes off Claire. "Quiet," the older man said. His tone was low, but it carried enough authority that every whisper in the room stopped. Brad turned, irritated. "Ethan, come on, this is just quiet." Ethan repeated, firmer this time. The owner stepped closer to the lane entrance, his lined face now completely focused. Claire heard the command, but she did not look up. Somewhere beyond the earmuffs and concrete walls, the rest of the world had disappeared. There was only breath, pressure, distance, and timing. The men behind her no longer looked amused. They looked suspended, caught between skepticism and the uneasy realization that they might have misunderstood the woman in front of them from the very first second she walked in. Brad felt it too, though he refused to name it. He folded his arms tighter, jaw clenched, trying to maintain the expression of a man still in charge. Then Claire's fingers settled gently against the trigger, and the entire long-distance section seemed to hold one collective breath with her. Claire Donovan took in one final breath and let half of it leave her body in a slow, controlled stream. Her finger tightened with such measured patience that no one in the room could tell the exact instant the rifle responded. The sharp cracks split through the concrete lane, bounced off the walls, and vanished into a silence so sudden it felt unnatural. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to blink. Every eye shot downrange toward the suspended paper target. The electronic monitor above lane 7 flickered once, then flashed the score in bright digital numbers. Dead center. Not near center. Not close enough to be lucky. Perfect center. A clean hit so exact that the target carrier gave a tiny metallic twitch as the paper spun slightly on its clip. Vince Holloway's mouth dropped open. The folded cash in his hand slipped to the floor unnoticed. One of the younger shooters whispered, "No way," but the words sounded swallowed by the room. Brad Mercer stared at the monitor as if it had malfunctioned. That is beginner luck," he said, though his voice came out thin and uncertain. Claire did not celebrate. She did not smile. She calmly lifted her face from the stock and worked the bolt with one smooth backward-forward motion before stepping away from the bench. The spent casing rolled across the rubber mat and settled against the lane divider with a tiny ringing sound that somehow felt louder than Brad's entire performance from 10 minutes earlier. Ethan Cole was already moving before anyone else found their speech. He walked directly to the monitor, squinting at the digital feed, then to the spotting camera mounted beside the lane. His weathered fingers tapped the replay button. On the small screen, enlarged for all to see, the bullet hole appeared exactly through the black center circle, touching the crossing point with almost surgical neatness. Ethan exhaled slowly. "That is no accident," he murmured. Brad forced out a laugh that fooled no one. "Come on, Ethan, even a blind squirrel gets lucky once." But Ethan did not answer him. He kept staring at Claire, and now there was something else in his eyes, something beyond curiosity. Recognition was trying to surface from a place buried years deep. Claire removed her hearing protection and set it neatly on the bench. Her face remained composed, but there was a faint distance in her expression, as though this room and these people were far less important than the memory she had just stepped through. Brad felt his authority sliding and lunged for one more chance to recover. "All right," he said quickly, clapping his hands once. "Nice shot. Impressive. But one lucky hit does not make anyone Annie Oakley." A few people shifted awkwardly. Nobody laughed. The mockery that had energized him earlier now sounded desperate, almost childish. Claire turned her eyes toward him for the first time since raising the rifle. "Would you like another?" she asked. Her tone was not challenging. It was calm, polite, almost generous. Yet those 4 words landed harder than the rifle report. Brad opened his mouth, then closed it. Ethan's head snapped fully upright. There it was. The voice. The composure. The strange economy in every movement. A memory from a sun-beaten military training field in California surged forward, years old, but suddenly vivid. A younger woman lying prone behind a precision rifle while seasoned instructors watched in stunned silence. Ethan took one slow step toward Claire, his brows knitting together. "Wait," he said, almost to himself. "I know that stance." Claire looked at him now, and for the first time a flicker of recognition passed across her steady blue eyes. Ethan's heartbeat kicked. He studied her face beneath the plain glasses, the tied-back hair, the faded sweater hiding the shoulders of someone who had once lived inside discipline. His voice dropped to a stunned whisper. Claire Donovan. Camp Pendleton National Sniper Trials. Dear Lord. And just like that, Brad Mercer realized the woman he had turned into a joke was someone Ethan Cole looked at with genuine awe. Brad Mercer felt every pair of eyes in the range slide off Claire Donovan and onto him, and for the first time that morning he understood what public embarrassment actually felt like. A few minutes earlier he had owned the room with jokes, smirks, and easy laughter. Now all of that confidence seemed to have drained through the cracks in the rubber floor. Camp Pendleton? Vince Holloway repeated under his breath, no longer sounding amused. Ethan Cole stepped closer, his lined face pale with disbelief. You were the woman who cleared the 1,000-yard qualification in crosswind conditions, he said, his voice growing steadier as memory locked into place. I was consulting that year. Nobody could stop talking about you. The younger shooters looked from Ethan to Claire as if the plain woman in the gray sweater had suddenly transformed into someone from another world. Claire gave the smallest nod. That was a long time ago, she said. Ethan let out a dry laugh of pure astonishment. Long time or not, people do not forget scores like that. Brad swallowed hard. The words around him no longer sounded like a joke spiraling out of control. They sounded like testimony. Worse, they sounded like witnesses confirming he had mocked the wrong person in front of an audience. He forced a brittle smile and tried to regain footing. Well, he said, clearing his throat, if she has experience, that explains the lucky shot. The room did not rescue him. No one chuckled. No one echoed his tone. Claire rested one hand lightly on the bench and looked at him with the same calm expression that had irritated him from the start. There was no triumph in her face, which somehow made it more uncomfortable. She did not need to gloat. His humiliation was doing the work for her. Ethan turned sharply toward Brad. Lucky, he said. That was not luck. That was textbook precision. Brad shifted under the older man's stare. I was just trying to keep things light. Ethan glanced at the cluster of men who had been placing bets moments earlier. Their eyes dropped one by one. You call that light? He asked. Sounded a lot like a pack of grown men entertaining themselves by underestimating somebody they never bothered to understand. The rebuke hit harder because it was spoken quietly. Brad opened his mouth, but no defense came. There are moments when arrogance searches desperately for an exit and finds none. This was one of them. Claire reached into her ammunition case again. The tiny motion made several heads lift. Brad blinked. You were shooting again? He asked. Claire selected another single round and held it between two fingers. You said one lucky shot does not prove much, she replied. You seemed unconvinced. Her tone remained even, almost courteous, but the challenge beneath it was unmistakable now. Vince took a half step backward, as if instinctively making room for something larger than a casual range demonstration. Ethan folded his arms and nodded once. Let her shoot. Brad wanted to refuse. He wanted to call the whole thing finished, laugh it off, send everyone back to their lanes, rewind the last 15 minutes into something survivable. But he could feel the room pressing in on him. If he stopped her now, it would look like fear. If he let her continue, he risked something worse. Yet some humiliations become unavoidable the second pride refuses to retreat early enough. Fine, he muttered. Take another. Claire loaded the round with the same smooth metallic click. This time there were no side comments, no betting slips, no sarcastic whispers. The men who had gathered behind the lines stood in complete silence, as if they were in the presence of an exam they had not prepared for. Ethan watched Claire settle behind the rifle again, and his expression changed from astonishment to something like respect. He remembered stories from that training field years ago, stories of a marksman who never raised her voice, never celebrated, and still left seasoned instructors shaking their heads. Brad Mercer stared at the woman he had mistaken for an easy target, and a cold realization began crawling up his spine. The first shot had taken his laughter. He had a sinking feeling the second one was about to take whatever pride he had left. Claire Donovan lowered herself behind the rifle once more, and this time nobody in Iron Ridge tactical range dared to breathe too loudly. The fluorescent hum overhead seemed sharper. The electronic target monitor blinked patiently at the far wall. Somewhere in the lobby, a register drawer closed, but inside the long-distance section, even that faint sound felt distant, irrelevant. All attention had narrowed to one woman in a faded gray sweater and the rifle resting against her shoulder as naturally as if the two had been designed together. Brad Mercer stood rigid beside the lane divider, trying to maintain a neutral face, but his jaw muscles twitched every few seconds. He hated that he was now the least confident person in his own range. Claire adjusted the rear support by less than an inch, checked the target through the scope, and settled into stillness. Ethan Cole watched her with folded arms, saying nothing. He already knew this second shot was not about proving skill. It was about proving that the first one had not been an accident and that Brad's condescension had no place left to hide. Claire inhaled, paused, and let the room feel the weight of waiting. Vince Holloway stared downrange, so hard his mirrored lenses reflected the pale square of the target. One of the younger shooters unconsciously removed his cap and held it against his chest like a spectator at some solemn ceremony. Brad noticed all of it, and every second made his discomfort worse. "Whenever you are ready," he muttered, though the words sounded weak, stripped of all earlier sarcasm. Claire's finger rested against the trigger. Another breath. Another microscopic shift in shoulder tension. Then the rifle answered with a crisp report that cut through the lane cleaner than the first. Heads snapped to the monitor. The digital screen flickered. For one suspended second, there was only static and collective silence. Then the image resolved. The new bullet hole had passed through the same center point, widening the original mark so precisely that it looked almost unreal, as if someone had enlarged the first shot with a blade rather than placed a second round through it. A split center. Perfect overlap. Ethan Cole let out an involuntary laugh of disbelief. "Good Lord," he whispered. Vince actually took off his glasses to make sure he was seeing correctly. The camouflage hat shooter leaned forward with both hands on the barrier. "That is impossible," he said. "Not impossible," Ethan replied without looking away. "Just rare enough that most people never witness it." Brad Mercer did not speak. His face had gone pale beneath the artificial lights. Claire calmly lifted her cheek from the stock, opened the bolt, and let the spent casing drop. The tiny brass cylinder spun once on the mat and settled near Brad's boot. He looked down at it as if it were physical evidence against him. Claire stood and removed her hearing protection. Her movements carried no drama, no smugness, no need for applause. That absence of showmanship made the scene even heavier. She was not performing for them. She was simply existing at a level none of them had bothered to imagine. Steady, unreadable, and Brad felt smaller under that calm gaze than he had under any shouted argument in his life. Because loud humiliation can be defended against, quiet superiority leaves nowhere to stand. Brad Mercer's apology stalled in his throat because he still had not figured out what shape it should take. Men like him were fluent in sarcasm, interruption, and authority. Genuine humility was a language they almost never practiced. Claire Donovan simply looked at him for a second, then turned back to the bench and began sliding her rifle into its cloth sleeve as though the room's astonishment had nothing to do with her. That composure unsettled everyone more than celebration would have. If she had smiled, they could have called it a victory lap. If she had lectured them, they could have dismissed it as ego answering ego. But she did neither. She moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who had nothing left to prove because she had never come there seeking anyone's approval in the first place. Ethan Cole stepped beside her, still shaking his head in disbelief. "I cannot believe you are here," he said. "After all these years." Claire zipped the bag halfway and gave him a faint polite smile. "My father used to bring me to local ranges before competitions," she said. "He passed last month. I found this place on the drive back from settling his things." Ethan's expression softened immediately. The spectators who had been standing in stunned silence shifted into an even deeper hush. The story in front of them was no longer just about a woman who could outshoot them. It was now a woman carrying private grief while being turned into a public joke by strangers who knew nothing about her. Claire rested one hand on the old canvas bag. "This was his rifle case," she added quietly. "I wanted one afternoon with familiar noise." Vince Holloway lowered his eyes. The camouflage hat shooter rubbed the back of his neck. Even the younger men who had only watched from the edges now looked uncomfortable, as if the concrete walls had suddenly become too close. Brad felt his stomach sink lower. Every new detail made his earlier comments sound uglier in hindsight. He remembered the souvenir earmuff joke, the pink rifle remark, the staged laughter. Each line replayed in his mind, now with the cruel brightness of fluorescent light. "Ms. Donovan," he said again, this time with no trace of performance. "I was out of line." Claire continued securing the zipper. "Yes," she said. Just that single word. No anger. No raised voice. Somehow that made Brad's face burn hotter than any shouted insult could have. Ethan looked at him, then at the men behind the safety line. "All of you were," he said. Nobody argued. Nobody even shifted defensively. The range that had felt loud and masculine and self-assured all morning now felt like a classroom after the teacher has exposed an uncomfortable truth. Brad took one hesitant step forward. "I thought." He stopped, because the sentence sounded pathetic before it even formed. "I thought you were inexperienced. I thought you did not belong. I thought your clothes told me who you were." Every version of that confession made him sound exactly like what he had been. Claire finally lifted the rifle bag from the bench. "You thought what most people think when they are in a hurry to feel superior," she said. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. Vince stared at the floor. Brad had no reply because she had named the mechanism perfectly. Superiority is often just rushed judgment wearing confidence as a costume. Claire adjusted the strap over her shoulder. "I did not come here to embarrass anyone," she continued in the same level tone. "I came here because I miss my father." That sentence landed across the room with devastating simplicity. Brad's eyes dropped. The mockery that had seemed harmless to him at the front counter now looked painfully childish beside the reason she had walked through the door. Ethan touched Claire's arm gently. "He must have been proud of you." Claire's lips pressed into the faintest smile, sad and restrained. "He taught me that accuracy starts long before the trigger," she said. Then she turned toward the exit. No one moved to stop her. No one dared fill the silence with another useless word. But as Brad Mercer watched the quiet woman walk away carrying an old rifle bag and a dignity none of them had managed to disturb, he realized the lesson was not finished yet. Claire paused at the doorway and looked back one final time. Claire Donovan stood at the doorway with one hand on the metal push bar, the old canvas rifle bag resting against her shoulder, and the entire range remained frozen behind her, as if no one wanted to risk breaking whatever invisible weight had settled over the room. Brad Mercer could hear the ventilation fans again now, could hear the faint electronic hum from the target monitors, could even hear the tiny rattle of brass near his boot, but all of those ordinary sounds only made the silence between people feel heavier. Claire looked back, not with anger, not with superiority, but with the calm steadiness of someone offering a truth whether others were ready for it or not. "My father used to say the loudest people on a firing line are usually the least accurate," she said. Her voice was soft, yet every syllable carried cleanly through the concrete section. Nobody moved. Brad felt those words land squarely where his pride had been standing all morning. Claire's eyes passed over Vince, the other shooters, then finally returned to Brad. "Accuracy begins before skill," she continued. "It begins with discipline, and discipline begins with respect." Ethan Cole lowered his head slightly, as if even he did not want to interrupt the moment. Brad swallowed. He had spent years believing respect was something demanded by volume, by authority, by acting like the smartest man in the room before anyone else could challenge it. But standing there now, with customers avoiding his gaze and a quiet woman teaching without once raising her voice, he saw how cheap that version of confidence really was. Claire gave the smallest nod, almost like closing a conversation that had already said enough. Then she pushed open the door and walked out. The metal door eased shut behind her with a muted thud, and no one spoke for several long seconds. Vince was the first to exhale. "I cannot believe we did that," he murmured. The camouflage hat shooter shook his head and quietly stuffed his betting cash back into his pocket like evidence he wished had never existed. One of the younger men looked downrange at the split center on the monitor and whispered, "She never once tried to make us feel stupid." Ethan answered him without taking his eyes off the closed door. She did not have to. That line hung in the air with painful accuracy. Brad stared at lane 7, at the bench where Claire had stood, at the perfect digital image still glowing on the screen like a permanent witness. He thought about how quickly he had judged the faded sweater, the old rifle bag, the lack of expensive accessories, the quiet voice. He had built an entire story about her in less than 10 seconds and treated that story like fact. Now that false certainty looked embarrassingly fragile. Ethan finally turned to him. "You run a shooting range," the older man said, his tone measured but firm. "People come here trusting this place to teach focus, patience, and responsibility. If all they learn from you is how to laugh at strangers, then you are not teaching a thing worth paying for." Brad had no defense left. He nodded once, slowly, the way people do when denial has become too expensive to maintain. Customers began drifting back to their lanes, but the energy had changed. Voices stayed lower. Movements felt more deliberate. Even Vince, usually loud and boastful, checked his own target in silence before loading another round. Lane 7 remained empty,